Well, Richard Johnson's with me, senior lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University in London. He's with me from Oxford in England. When I read the report, I think the interesting thing is at the end, the disagreement and dissent by the chairman is only on the release of the report. There is no dissent on the findings, which leads one to conclude that essentially it was unanimous, that all members of the committee agreed with its findings.
I think that's probably a good inference, Richard. This is really a significant point as well, because we're talking about a Republican House of Representatives, a Republican-led committee. Now, Matt Gaetz would probably say, look, the standard of evidence here is not the same as the standard of evidence in a court of law. The federal prosecutors looked into this and decided to move no further with it. But in terms of the fact-finding, the evidence that the committee undertook, I mean, that's real evidence that the committee was collecting there. And when those facts were laid before the committee members, I agree, we cannot see dissent on the point of facts as was collected by the committee, by any of the committee members.
So in a nutshell, do you think Matt Gaetz is done for, in a sense? I mean, one never wants to sort of say anyone's political career is over and done with. Look at Donald Trump. I mean, if he can go and say what he did and still comes back. But the statutory rape bit's quite difficult to get over.
But I think the point that you've just made, look at Donald Trump, is really relevant here. You know, Gaetz' political career, his national political career, has been shaped by his loyalty to Donald Trump. And like Trump, as you know, Steve Bannon was saying, Gaetz will follow a similar strategy here, which is to deny the allegations, to denounce the moves against him as politically motivated, and then to distract or to deflect and to point the finger at someone else or to pick up on another story. And yes, these are very serious allegations, but I think we live in a political ecosystem now where there are many people around who support President Trump who believe that his allies are being targeted for political reasons. And even though we might say, look, this is a Republican-led committee, this was a Republican House of Representatives that looked into this, that may not be seen as particularly relevant by the type of people who are active in the Republican Party and who vote in Republican primaries. And so I think as long as Gaetz feels that there is still a constituency within the Republican Party who votes in primaries in Florida, then I don't think we can count him out.
Okay, what about Donald Trump? I mean, the fact that he didn't just want to appoint him to the cabinet, he wanted to appoint him as the chief law officer. And you know, I suppose some would say, well, you know, it's an error, more than an error of judgment to have tried to appoint this particular man to this particular post. But again, there doesn't seem to be a political price that Mr. Trump will pay for that, or am I missing something?
No, I don't think Trump will pay a particular political price from this. I mean, of course, there will be many people who will form that same analysis that you've just made, but those people were not likely to have been supporters of Trump anyway. And the issue, or the way that Trump has approached all of these issues of sort of congressional investigations, for example, both into him and people around him, and the 6th of January, and so on, is to frame it in that language of the swamp and the deep state and the establishment against him. And so he just uses that as more evidence that there are, you know, the elite are teaming up against him, and he's fighting the elite.
I'm grateful for you, sir. Thank you. Good morning to you, and a very Merry Christmas.